After living in Johannesburg, however, we moved to the Free State. My father was a priest, a Methodist priest. And there were certain things that happened in my life there as a child, again, witnessing things that made me very aware as almost, I think, 5-6-year-old that something was really not right in our world. And then from Free State, we moved to Cape Town.
And what type of discussions were you having in your home? Your father was a priest, but were there any, political discussions? Where did that awareness come from?
It's funny, I was thinking about this for a long time. Like, what were the seeds that were planted? I think that part of it was growing up with the sense that everything's not right in the world. So my mother, for witnessing my mother being told, gaan achten to go and get bread or buy bread at a shop, and knowing that something is not right with that scene, because this is my mother, someone I deeply love and respect. And then, of course, in our home, my mother was very involved in women's movement in the church, which had a lot of various activities that were running. So I grew up with a mother who was very independent and who had her own program. Her program was not programming herself around us necessarily. And that we knew that there was a sense of urgency and importance to the work that she was doing. That was something that we were raised with, that we never questioned. And similarly with my father. My father was the person who exposed me to liberation theology, because that's really what led to his service in the world, because he regarded his work as a priest, as a minister, more than just about preaching. And so between my parents and then in our wider family, because my grandfather from my mother's side, he was one of the founding members of the African People's Organization. My aunt from my mother's side was a founder of the Garment Workers Union. And my other aunt, who's also late, Beverly Jansen, she was also an activist for decades. So in our family, both within our close, intimate family, but in the broader family, and that's very difficult to distinguish between them, there were always conversations about politics and specifically about justice and equity. So the idea of what justice is, what it could be, how it's not in the context that we were growing up, was something that my sisters and I, my siblings and I, were very conscious of. And so my younger sister at primary school was reading Marxist-Leninist texts. Once I went to high school, we all went to Livingston High School in Claremont because my mother was there as a student. We would be exposed to Unity Movement, to R.O. Dudley. These were people that were part of our growing up and learning and political education. And then I became recruited to the SRC, so it took on a kind of institutional framework, this learning and politicking and all of that.
All right, so when you chose to leave the church, so to say, and were you still at school at that time, and can you link that to your involvement with the SRC?
Well, actually, no. I was still very much involved in the church at the time when I was at high school. In fact, one of the organizations that we set up, which was anti-apartheid organizations, was specifically to work with young people who were in churches that were not anti-apartheid, that actually served the apartheid authorities in preaching submissiveness and all of that. And so I was very much still a part of the church and working in the youth, being a youth leader, and so on. And so the liberation theology, again, translated into my activism at a church level, and at school, guiding awareness programs. So being responsible for my grade level, what that was called now a grade, but it was those days it was a standard.
What was happening in the city at that time, in the Western Cape? And what it was going on at that time, how did that impact the work that you were doing?
Immensely. It continues to impact on me. There's such a reverberation of the past in the present. So one of the churches we were based at was in Athlone, so it was the Athlone Methodist Church, and my father was the priest there. And I think there were two things that were happening at the same time that when I reflect on it, and that's partly why I think so many of us continue to be traumatized, is that we were coexisting with two wars. On the one hand, there was a state war against us as a body, as people, as a community, through forced removals that continue to happen. So even while I was schooling at Livingston, which is in Claremont, we were training for marathons on the streets where my mother and her family were forcibly removed from. But whilst we were being educated, there were other families who were still being removed. So there was the sense of it was not done then. It wasn't finished, that work of separation. So there was that war that was happening, which became very tangible. So I would, for example, come home from SRC meetings or training, because we often underwent training on minute taking and taking on certain roles, and having a Casper parked on the pavement in front of our house, and later, for days, and later realizing that the Casper was there as part of a whole military movement which led to the death of one of the comrades who had been holed up and secured in the area very close to where we lived. So there was that warfare that was on the body, that was on the mind, that was in terms of where we could go, what we could do. So we would literally be witnesses to gang warfare, just across our road. And knowing that the next day, if we were to walk across that field, there would be evidence remaining of what had taken place. And so that was also an interrelated part of what formed me. And then my decision, also again at a young age, that I would needed to do something about it, and constantly thinking about what I would be doing. And so working with children after school care programs in Q-Town, or storytelling sessions, gathering children during holiday periods, thinking that there would always be a role for me to play. And I think that's something, again, from my family, from the people around me, that it was not enough for us to speak against the abuse and the violence that happened.
Were you ever, involved in any of the other political meetings with the youth organization? There are many church organizations who joined the protests, who were involved in organizing the masses, mobilizing parents, students, etc.
Yeah.
Was that...
So one of the things which we did was to infiltrate. So we'd go to prayer meetings, or we'd go to camps, youth camps, and we would very quietly ask questions that would bring a liberation theology perspective to the way in which the Bible was being translated or interpreted. And in fact, Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote the letter of support for the organization so that we could, raise the funds to be able to continue doing this work. So that was on the one level. That's one of the things that we did, was to do the work quietly and through influence, through asking questions as opposed to antagonizing or direct action. However, there were marches that we participated in as well. And then also one of the things we did as Methodists was, together with Craig Orenser and Rodney, we would go out to the West Coast and we would work on a project. So there was an annual camp where young people drawn from various churches and across the racial divide would come together, and we would work at building an old age home. So renovating a clinic into an old age home for the local community in Namakoland. But those processes were also processes where we were able to sit down and have conversations about the Bible and reinterpreting the Bible, and what it's calling us to do as young Christians and young Christians in action. So what is it that we need to do in order to change our society and so on. And that was also very pivotal, because we had young people who were from white families, who often returned with a very strong sense of purpose, and who would be thrown out of their homes because they refused to go to the army, or because they had particular perspectives on things that were very different to their parents. So that was another form of action that took place. And during the time of my life as a student at the University of Cape Town with my first degree and so on, I became very active with the rape crisis, because already, before it again became popular, the notion of intersectionality, it was very clear to me, very visible, that there were intersections between class, gender, and anti-apartheid struggle. And so my activism became fomented in the kind of feminist thinking in that particular period as a student at the university, and became more formed and formulated. So that later in life, with the work that I continued to do within the cultural sector and the education sector, those intersections are palpable. And it's, I make it a very conscious part of my work.
And did you ever have any mentors, like apart from your parents and your aunts who were all activists, and uncles and your grandfather and so on? Were there any women in your life who, were maybe from the different organizations, that sort of?
Yeah, I would say, I think that, Gertrude Fester, who, she was a neighbor at some stage in Maitland, her work, her activism was really, how do I say that? It reached the heart activism, in the sense that I was able to recognize in her, as with my family, there's a way that you can be in the world. You imagine yourself outside of the confines of this box, and you have the right to be it. You have the right to challenge. You have the right to resist. You have the right to imagine yourself as this person, this full person that you are, even though society says something different. But at the time, it was really resistant to Black women's voices, or women of color speaking in community and as a collective. And so those, as my peers, people like Puma Kola, Khabiba Badaroon, Desiree Lewis, Dimitri Erasmus, we were all part of this group, my sister Joanne Prince. And there, I think the activism, particularly from a Black feminist perspective, was consolidated for me. And so my peers became the space for experimentation and for imagination, because it was a safe space for us to argue with each other and differ, because we came from such different ideological, political perspectives, Black consciousness, charterists, and so that space was a good space for us, because I think for me, my experience of the Western Cape during the anti-apartheid period was that it was very much siloed, that you had to declare that you were a charterist, or you were BC, or you were AZAP, or it was very difficult to say, but actually no, it's about justice and equity. And so the Women of Color group, consciousness raising group, for me was a pivotal platform from which I could consolidate and form my thinking.